So when are you and Jason going to tie the knot? My mother's voice cut through the din of Thanksgiving dinner, and I watched her fumble for my boyfriend's name the way she always did, the way she'd been doing for 6 years. The table fell quiet, 17 relatives suddenly interested in their plates, and I felt James stiffen beside me. "It's James," he said, his voice tight with the patience he'd cultivated over dozens of these family gatherings. "We've been together 6 years." My mother waved her hand dismissively, the gesture so casual it might have seemed accidental to anyone who didn't know better. But I knew better. I had spent 28 years knowing better. "Right, James. So when's the wedding?" Victoria's was so perfect. Just perfect. "Best day of my life." She dabbed at her eyes like she might cry again just thinking about it, and I felt something shift inside my chest, something that had been building for longer than I wanted to admit. I put down my fork carefully, precisely, and looked directly at her. The words came out calmer than I felt. "I got married last year. October 14th. You weren't invited." The silence that descended was absolute, the kind of quiet that seems to have weight and texture, and I watched my mother's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally land on anger. Looking back now, I can see that moment as the culmination of everything that had come before. But sitting there at that table, I mostly felt tired. Tired of being the daughter whose name my parents forgot at family gatherings, whose accomplishments earned distracted nods while Victoria's Instagram post prompted champagne toasts. I was the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who'd put herself through college while Victoria got a monthly allowance and mom's platinum card. I was a senior software engineer at a major tech company in San Francisco, pulling in a salary that would have shocked them if they'd ever bothered to ask, while Victoria was a lifestyle influencer whose primary achievement was making brunch look aspirational. But Victoria was vibrant, vivacious, the daughter who demanded attention and received it in abundance. And I was just Maya, reliable Maya, practical Maya, Maya who would be fine, because Maya was always fine. Except I wasn't fine, and I hadn't been fine for a very long time. And that Thanksgiving dinner when my mother couldn't even remember my partner's name was just the moment when I finally stopped pretending otherwise. The pattern had been there my entire life, woven so tightly into the fabric of our family that I'd almost stopped noticing it, the way you stop hearing the hum of the refrigerator until someone points it out and suddenly it's all you can hear. When Victoria graduated high school, my parents threw her a party at the country club, 200 guests and a DJ and a cake that cost more than my monthly rent would later cost in my first apartment. When I graduated from Stanford 3 years later with a degree in computer science and a 3.9 GPA, my mother took me to brunch at a chain restaurant and spent most of the meal on her phone coordinating something for Victoria's latest crisis. I paid for my own meal. I remembered that detail with startling clarity, sitting there at that Thanksgiving table years later, how I'd pulled out my wallet and my mother hadn't even noticed, hadn't even looked up from her phone. The financial disparity had always been the most concrete evidence of the difference in how they saw us, impossible to dismiss or reframe as anything other than what it was. My parents paid Victoria's rent throughout college even though she'd chosen a small liberal arts school specifically because it was aesthetic for her Instagram, funded her sorority dues and her spring break trips and her wardrobe, handed her a credit card and told her not to worry about the bills. I worked 2 jobs to pay my way through Stanford, took out loans that I'd spent the first 3 years of my career paying off. And when I asked my father if he could help with books one semester, he'd sent me $300 and told me he was proud of me for being so independent. Victoria got $40,000 a year in support. I got praised for not needing any. When I landed my first job offer at a major tech company in San Francisco with a starting salary of $92,000, my mother said, "That's wonderful, sweetie," in the same tone she used when I told her I'd gotten my oil changed, and then she spent 20 minutes showing me Victoria's latest Instagram post that had gotten 10,000 likes. When Victoria hit 100,000 followers, my parents took her to Hawaii to celebrate. The casual cruelty of it wasn't even intentional, which somehow made it worse, because I could have fought against malice, but I had no defense against indifference. They didn't sit around plotting ways to dismiss me. They simply didn't think about me as much, didn't hold space for me in their minds and hearts the way they did for Victoria. And every introduction where they forgot James's name, every phone call where they cut me off to take Victoria's call, every holiday where my accomplishments were footnotes to her narratives, was just another small piece of evidence that I'd been collecting for years without even realizing I was building a case. Victoria got engaged in February, with the kind of proposal that seemed designed for maximum social media impact, Chad orchestrating a flash mob in Union Square with professional photographers stationed at 3 different angles to capture her surprised expression. And within hours, the photos were everywhere, tagged and filtered and accompanied by breathless captions about true love and fairy tales. My mother called me 4 times that day, each call beginning with some variation of, "Can you believe it?" and "Isn't it magical?" And not once did she ask how I was doing or what was happening in my life, and I made appropriate, excited noises while staring at my computer screen at work, debugging code and feeling something cold settle in my chest. The wedding planning began immediately, my mother launching into venue research with the intensity of a military campaign, and every phone call became a monologue about floral arrangements and invitation fonts and whether the reception should have a champagne tower. James proposed to me 6 weeks later, in a way that was so perfectly us that I cried. A quiet evening hike to our favorite overlook in Marin, the bay spread out below us catching the sunset, and he told me he'd known since our second date that he wanted to spend his life with me, and when I called my parents the next day to tell them, my mother said, "That's nice, dear," in a distracted voice, and then immediately launched into a crisis about Victoria's save-the-date cards. I felt the words die in my throat, felt myself shrinking back into the familiar role of audience member to Victoria's starring performance, and when I tried again to talk about our plans, my mother said, and then, "Now about Victoria's wedding venue, do you think the harbor view or the grand estate sounds better?" I told James about it that night and watched his face do something complicated, something between anger and sadness, and he held me while I pretended I wasn't hurt. The financial confirmation of my place in their hierarchy came 2 weeks later when my father took us both out to dinner, Victoria and Chad at one end of the table receiving the news that Dad would be contributing $50,000 to their wedding, his voice warm with pride as he talked about wanting to give his little girl the perfect day. And then he turned to me almost as an afterthought and said he wanted to help us too, and I felt hope flutter stupidly in my chest until he handed me an envelope containing a check for $500 to help out with whatever you're planning. Victoria didn't even notice the discrepancy, or if she did, she saw it as natural and deserved, and I sat there doing the math in my head, calculating the exact ratio of their love, reducing it to a number that I could understand, 100 to 1. I thanked him because that's what I'd been trained to do, thanked him, and folded the check carefully, and ignored James's hand tightening on mine under the table, and when Victoria asked what kind of wedding we were thinking about, I started to describe the small ceremony we'd been imagining, and my mother interrupted to ask Victoria if she'd decided between roses and peonies, and I stopped talking mid-sentence, and nobody noticed. Victoria's wedding planning consumed the next 6 months like a wildfire, burning through every conversation and family gathering until there was nothing left but ashes of whatever relationship I'd hoped we might have. And I watched myself disappear into the role of unpaid wedding coordinator while being systematically excluded from any position of actual honor. The bridesmaid announcement came on a Sunday afternoon in April when my mother called to tell me Victoria had finalized her bridal party, her voice bright with excitement as she listed the names: Victoria's college roommate Madison, her sorority sister Bryn, our cousin Jessica, who Victoria hadn't spoken to in 3 years but who had a massive social media following, and Chad's 2 sisters, who Victoria actively complained about in private. I waded through the entire list, my stomach tightening with each name that wasn't mine, And when my mother finished, I said carefully, "So I'm not a bridesmaid?" And there was a pause that lasted just long enough for me to understand that they'd discussed this, that it had been a conscious decision, before my mother said, "Well, you know, Victoria wanted to keep it to people who really fit the aesthetic she's going for, and you're just not really the bridesmaid type, you know?" I didn't know what that meant. The bridesmaid type, didn't know what part of me was so fundamentally wrong that my own sister wouldn't want me standing beside her. But I said okay, because what else was there to say? The exclusion from the bridal party didn't mean exclusion from the work, though. And over the following months, I found myself running errands for centerpiece supplies, picking up bridesmaid dresses from the alterations shop, assembling welcome bags for out-of-town guests, doing all the tedious logistics that Victoria was too busy to handle, and the actual bridesmaids were too important to bother with. I tried to talk about my own wedding plans during these endless planning sessions, mentioning that James and I were thinking about a ceremony in wine country, something intimate and meaningful, but every time I brought it up, my mother would say, "Mm-hmm," while scrolling through pictures of cake toppers, or my father would check his phone. And once, in a conversation I still replayed late at night when I couldn't sleep, my mother forgot my wedding date 3 times in a single 15-minute phone call, asking me when it was, then asking again 5 minutes later, as if I hadn't just told her, then asking a third time before I finally said, October 14th, in a voice that came out harder than I intended, and she said, "Right, right, I'll put it in my calendar." But I knew she wouldn't. Knew it the way you know when someone is lying without being able to point to any specific tell. James started coming to fewer family dinners after he witnessed my mother talk over me 6 times in one meal. Every attempt I made to contribute to the conversation simply erased as if I hadn't spoken. And when I asked him why he was pulling back, he looked at me with something like grief in his eyes and said, "Maya, I can't keep watching them treat you like you don't matter, and I can't keep watching you accept it." And I felt something crack open in my chest, because he was right. I had been accepting it, had been showing up for every slight and dismissal like a dog that keeps coming back no matter how many times it gets kicked. Victoria's wedding took place on a Saturday in early September at the grand estate overlooking the harbor, the kind of venue that cost more than I'd earned in my first year as a software engineer. And from the moment I arrived, I understood that I was there to work, not to celebrate. My mother handed me a box of programs at the entrance and asked me to make sure they were distributed properly, then sent me to check that the place cards were arranged correctly, then had me track down the photographer to confirm the timeline, and I moved through these tasks like a ghost at someone else's party, watching my sister hold court in her $1,000 dress while I wore the navy shift I'd bought on sale and hoped would let me blend into the background. I wasn't in the family photos, not the formal ones anyway, though I stood nearby holding Victoria's bouquet and my mother's clutch while they posed in endless configurations. And when Aunt Carol asked why I wasn't being included, my mother said, "Oh, we're just doing the bridal party right now," even though they'd already taken 20 shots that included my parents and grandparents and Victoria's college friends. During the reception dinner, I sat at a table near the back with some of Chad's distant relatives who didn't know anyone, while Victoria and the bridal party occupied the head table and my parents sat at the table of honor beside them. And I watched my father's eyes get wet during the father-daughter dance, watched him hold Victoria like she was made of something precious and rare. And I tried to remember if he'd ever looked at me that way and came up empty. The speeches started after dinner, my mother rising with champagne glass in hand to talk about her daughters, about how blessed she was to have 2 wonderful girls, but especially on this day, especially Victoria. And she went on for 7 minutes about Victoria's beauty and grace and the joy she'd brought to their lives. And when she mentioned me, it was one sentence, "And of course, Maya is here too," before pivoting back to the bride, and I felt James's hand find mine under the table and squeeze hard. Extended family members kept asking me about my own wedding throughout the night, relatives who actually remembered I existed. And every time the question came up within my parents' hearing, my mother would smoothly redirect the conversation, or my father would suddenly need to talk to someone across the room. Until finally, Aunt Carol caught me near the bar and asked directly, "So when is your big day, sweetie?" And my mother materialized beside us, saying, "Oh, she's not in a rush. Are you, Maya? You've always been so practical about these things." And I opened my mouth to let it go like I always did, but something in me had calcified during those 7 minutes of my mother's speech, and I heard myself say, "Actually, it's in 6 weeks, October 14th." And my mother's face did something strange before she recovered and said, "Oh, right, the little courthouse thing. Very practical, very you." And that word again, practical, which I understood now meant small, meant forgettable, meant not worth the effort of a real celebration. James had been standing close enough to hear everything, and when I looked at him, I saw something shift in his expression, saw him really see what I'd been trying to explain for years. And later that night, as we drove home in silence, he finally said, "We're not doing this." And I said, "What?" And he said, "We're not giving them the chance to make your wedding feel like this, like an afterthought, like something that doesn't matter." And I started to protest out of habit, started to say it was fine, but he cut me off and said, "Maya, it's not fine. None of this is fine, and you deserve better." And I sat there in the passenger seat watching streetlights blur past and felt something click into place. Some door closing on the version of myself who kept begging for scraps from people who would never see me as enough. The decision came together in the days after Victoria's wedding, like something that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. And when James said we should get married without them, I felt the guilt rise up immediately. The old programming that told me family was family no matter what. But underneath the guilt was something else, something that felt like relief. Like finally, I could have something that was mine, without their judgment casting shadows over it. We started planning the next week, sitting at our kitchen table with laptops open and a bottle of wine between us. And I felt giddy in a way I hadn't let myself feel before, choosing a venue not because it would photograph well for my mother's friends, but because the golden light through the vineyard rows in the photos made my chest ache with wanting. We settled on a small winery in Napa Valley, a place called Autumn Ridge that specialized in intimate ceremonies, and the coordinator quoted us $30,000 for 40 guests, including ceremony, reception, wine, and a weekend accommodation package. And James looked at me to make sure I was comfortable with the cost, because it was money we'd saved carefully over 3 years. Money we'd planned to use for a wedding and a honeymoon and the start of our life. And I said yes without hesitation, because for once I wanted something beautiful that was just ours. The guest list came together easily once I stopped trying to include people out of obligation, and I wrote down James's parents who had always treated me with warmth, his sister and her family, his college friends who had become our friends, my own friends from work and grad school who actually knew me, and then I paused with my pen over the paper before writing Aunt Carol's name, the only member of my family who had ever really seen me. When I called to invite her, I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to be honest if this puts you in an awkward position." And I explained that we were getting married in October, that it would be small and beautiful, and that my parents and Victoria weren't invited. And there was a pause before Aunt Carol said, "Does this feel right to you, sweetheart?" And I said, "Yes, it really does." And she said, "Then I'll be there, and I'm honored you want me." And I heard in her voice that she understood, that maybe she'd been waiting for me to choose myself for longer than I knew. The relief that flooded through me as we finalized plans was almost frightening in its intensity. The realization that I could have a wedding day without my mother's criticism, or my father's distraction, or Victoria's need to center herself, without the constant low-grade anxiety of trying to be enough for people who had decided long ago that I wasn't. And as September turned into October and our wedding date approached, I didn't tell my parents, didn't send an announcement or make an excuse. Just let the date pass in their awareness like everything else about my life had always passed, unnoticed and unremarked, and for the first time that invisibility felt like freedom instead of abandonment. October 14th arrived with the kind of crystalline autumn light that made everything look like it had been dipped in gold. And I woke up in the guest cottage at Autumn Ridge Winery without the knot of anxiety I'd carried before Victoria's wedding, without the fear that I wouldn't be enough or that someone would find me wanting, and instead I felt something I'd almost forgotten was possible. A pure, uncomplicated joy that started in my chest and radiated outward until I was smiling at my reflection while my friend Sarah pinned my hair. The ceremony was set for 4 in the afternoon, when the light would slant perfectly through the vineyard rows, and our 40 guests gathered on the terrace overlooking the valley, while a string quartet played something classical and beautiful. And when it was time to walk down the aisle, James's parents stood up together and came to get me, his mother taking one arm and his father taking the other. And his mother said, "We're so honored, sweetheart," with tears in her eyes. And I realized this was what it felt like to be chosen, to be valued, to have someone stand beside you with pride instead of obligation. James cried when he saw me, actually cried, and the ceremony itself was everything we'd wanted, personal and meaningful, our friend officiating with words about partnership and mutual respect, and the family we were creating together. And when we exchanged rings, I felt the weight of his settle on my finger like a promise that I was worth promises, worth permanence, worth celebration. Aunt Carol's toast during the reception made half the guests cry, the way she talked about watching me grow up quiet and steady and brilliant, about how I'd built a career through pure determination and how I'd chosen a partner who saw all of that and loved me, not despite my quietness, but because of the depth it represented. And she said, "Maya has never needed anyone's permission to be extraordinary. She's always been extraordinary. And I'm grateful that today we all get to celebrate what some of us have been seeing all along." And the applause that followed felt like being seen, really seen, maybe for the first time. My coworkers told stories about the project I'd led that had saved our company $3 million, about my promotion to senior software engineer at 27, about the fact that I was already being courted for team lead positions, and I watched James beam with pride beside me and realized my parents had never once asked about my work with genuine curiosity, had never known that I made $180,000 a year, or that I was respected in my field, or that I'd built something substantial and real. The whole day unfolded like a dream I'd been afraid to have, dancing with James as the sun set over the vineyard, laughing with friends who knew my middle name and my coffee order, and the things that mattered to me, cutting a cake that we'd chosen because we liked lemon and didn't care if it was trendy, and when it was over, and we left for our honeymoon in Italy. I didn't think about my parents once during those 2 weeks, didn't wonder what they were doing, or whether they'd noticed my absence, just lived inside the life James and I were building together. And when we came home to our apartment, and eventually to our regular routines, I felt the wedding settle into my bones as proof that I could have beautiful things, that I deserved them, that joy didn't require their approval to be real. The year that followed the wedding passed in a strange kind of peace I hadn't known was possible, a life lived at a distance from my parents that let me breathe without the constant weight of their disappointment pressing down on my shoulders. I didn't tell them about the marriage, didn't send an announcement or update my social media, where my mother occasionally scrolled through my posts with the kind of casual disinterest she'd always shown my life. And because they never asked about me with any real depth or curiosity, they never discovered that I'd become someone's wife, that I wore a ring every day that meant something to someone. The phone calls came every few weeks, my mother's voice bright and superficial, asking if I was well, if work was fine, and before I could answer with anything substantive, she'd pivot to Victoria, to some crisis or triumph that required immediate discussion, and I'd make appropriate sounds while cooking dinner or folding laundry, half listening to stories about people who had never really seen me. Once my father asked if James and I had set a date yet, and I said, "We're figuring things out," which was true in its way. We were figuring out our married life together, and he said, "Well, don't wait too long, your mother wants to plan something." And I said nothing at all because what was there to say to a man who thought planning mattered more than presents, so... In the meantime, James and I bought a house, a 3-bedroom craftsman in a neighborhood with good schools, even though we weren't sure yet about children, And I got promoted to team lead at work with a salary increase that brought me to $200,000 a year. And we adopted a dog named Copper who slept between us at night. And we built a life that was full and real and ours. I heard through Aunt Carol that Victoria's marriage was showing cracks, that Chad had opinions about everything from her clothes to her friends, and that she'd stopped posting quite so many glowing updates about their perfect life. But when I mentioned this casually to my mother during one of our brief calls, she said, "Oh, all couples adjust. They're fine. They're perfect together," with the kind of fierce insistence that left no room for reality. My mother never asked about my promotion or the house, or whether James and I were happy, never inquired into the details of my days or the shape of my dreams. And slowly I stopped waiting for her to ask, stopped carrying that hope around like something precious that might finally be fulfilled. James's family became my family in the ways that mattered. Sunday dinners at his parents' house where his mother asked about my projects at work and actually listened to the answers. Holidays with his sister's kids who called me Aunt Maya and meant it. And I found myself relaxing into the warmth of people who had chosen to love me without conditions or comparisons. Aunt Carol and I talked every week, long conversations where I told her about the house renovations and the challenges at work, and the trip James and I were planning to Japan, and she told me about her book club and her garden and the watercolor class she'd started taking, and sometimes she'd say, "Have you talked to your mother?" And I'd say briefly, and she'd sigh in a way that held understanding and sadness both. The distance from my parents stopped feeling like abandonment and started feeling like protection, like a boundary I'd drawn around myself that let me grow into who I actually was, instead of constantly contorting to fit into the small space they'd allotted me. And for the first time in my life, I felt the frantic need for their approval quiet into something manageable, something I could live with. The grief of never having had the parents I needed settling into acceptance that I'd survived their limitations and built something beautiful anyway. The invitation arrived in early November, a group text from my mother to the extended family about Thanksgiving at their house, the annual gathering that had been tradition for as long as I could remember, and I stared at my phone feeling the old familiar tightness in my chest that came with the prospect of entering their orbit again. I hadn't been home for a major holiday in a year, had made excuses about work deadlines and travel conflicts, and a convenient bout of food poisoning last Christmas. And the distance had been a gift I'd given myself, space to breathe without their casual dismissal pressing down on everything I said or did. James found me in the kitchen looking at the invitation with something he'd learned to recognize as my pre-family interaction anxiety, and he said, "We don't have to go. We can do Thanksgiving with my parents or just the two of us." And I appreciated that he always gave me the exit, always made it clear that I had choices beyond obligation. But something in me had shifted over the year of distance and peace. Something had settled into place during all those months of building a life they knew nothing about. And I realized I didn't want to hide anymore, didn't want to keep making excuses or pretending I was too busy, when the truth was, I'd been protecting myself from people who should never have been dangerous to me. "I want to go," I told James, and he looked at me with concern and question both. And I said, "I'm not hiding anymore. I'm not ashamed of anything I've done. And if they can't be bothered to know me, then that's their failure, not mine." I started preparing mentally in the days leading up to Thanksgiving, not the way I used to prepare by rehearsing accomplishments I might mention or thinking of ways to redirect conversation to include myself, but instead by reminding myself that I didn't need anything from them, that I was going as an observer of my old life rather than a participant begging for scraps of attention. The morning of Thanksgiving, I put on my wedding ring, the platinum band with small diamonds that James had chosen because he said it reminded him of starlight, and I'd gotten in the habit of taking it off during the few brief visits I'd made home over the year, some instinct to protect something precious from their indifference. But this time I left it on and felt its weight as a reminder of what I'd built without them. James drove us to my parents' house in our new car, a sensible hybrid that we'd purchased in cash, And during the 40-minute drive, I felt my resolve solidifying into something calm and unshakable, not anger exactly, but a kind of clarity that came from finally understanding that their blindness to my worth said everything about them and nothing about me. We pulled up to the house just after noon, and I could already see cars lining the street. My aunt's SUV and my uncle's truck and my grandmother's sedan. The whole extended family gathered for my mother's performance of domestic perfection. And through the front window, I caught a glimpse of Victoria gesturing dramatically about something, while my mother nodded with rapt attention. And I took a breath and opened the car door and walked toward the chaos with James beside me, and no expectation of anything beyond exactly what they'd always given me, which was nothing at all. The house was full when we walked in, the familiar chaos of extended family gatherings with my mother's two sisters and their husbands clustered in the living room, my cousins scattered between the kitchen and den, my grandmother holding court from the good armchair near the fireplace, and the smell of turkey and stuffing thick in the air that always meant obligation disguised as tradition. My mother looked up from basting something when we entered and said, "Oh, Maya, you're here," with the same tone she might use for a delivery driver, no warmth or particular interest. And then immediately, "Victoria just got asked to be a brand ambassador for that skincare line. Isn't that amazing?" to the room at large, and I said, "Hello, Mom," and moved past her because I'd stopped waiting for greetings that felt like they meant something. James and I made our way through the standard rounds of hellos, my uncle shaking James's hand and calling him Jason, which James corrected for the fourth time in 6 years. My aunt kissing my cheek and saying I looked thin, which was her way of expressing something she thought was concern. My cousins waving from where they were watching football with the kind of casual acknowledgement that came from being family members who existed in the same space, but had never really known each other beyond surface pleasantries. Victoria was in the kitchen wearing something expensive and impractical, her hair and makeup perfect even for a family dinner, and she was telling my mother's sister about some trip to Aspen that Chad had planned, and when she saw me she said, "Maya, hi," and immediately returned to her story, as if I'd been a brief interruption in something important, and I felt the old familiar invisibility settle over me like a coat I'd worn so many times I knew exactly how it fit. I helped in the kitchen because that's what I'd always done, chopping vegetables and setting the table while conversations flowed around me about Victoria's latest Instagram post, and my cousin Jennifer's new promotion, and my grandmother's bridge club drama. And when I mentioned that James and I had just returned from a weekend in Portland, someone said, "That's nice," and the subject changed before I could say anything else about the brewery tour we'd taken or the bookstore where we'd spent 3 hours. Aunt Carol arrived an hour before dinner, carrying her famous sweet potato casserole, and when she saw me, she pulled me into a real hug and whispered, "How are you holding up?" And I whispered back, "I'm okay." And she squeezed my hand in a way that said she understood everything I wasn't saying, and I watched her exchange a look with my mother that held some tension I couldn't quite read, some knowledge that sat between them unspoken. Dinner began with the usual ceremony of everyone finding their seats at the extended table my father had set up, using two folding tables and the dining room table pushed together. The good china my mother only used for holidays, the carefully arranged centerpiece of gourds and small pumpkins that Victoria had pronounced rustic chic with approval. And I found myself seated between James and my cousin's husband, near the far end, while Victoria sat at my mother's right hand in the position of honor she'd always occupied. My mother spent the first 20 minutes of the meal recounting Victoria's wedding, which had been 18 months ago now, but still served as my mother's favorite story, her voice bright with remembered joy as she described the ceremony and the reception and the moment Victoria and Chad had their first dance. And she said, "It was just the best day of my life, seeing my baby girl so happy, so perfect, everything was absolutely perfect." And my father nodded agreement, and I cut my turkey into smaller and smaller pieces, while James's hand found my knee under the table in silent support. I sat quiet through most of dinner, observing the dynamics I'd been part of for 28 years, with the clarity that came from a year of distance. Watching how my mother's attention followed Victoria like a spotlight while I remained in comfortable shadow, how my father asked Victoria about her opinions on things, but never turned the same curiosity toward me, how the extended family had learned the pattern so thoroughly that they too directed their interest and questions toward the daughter who had always been presented as more worthy of such attention. My wedding ring caught the light from the chandelier every time I lifted my fork, the diamonds reflecting small points of brightness that seemed absurdly obvious to me, but that no one else appeared to notice. Not my mother studying Victoria's manicure, not my father refilling wine glasses, not my cousins absorbed in their own conversations, and I realized they didn't see it because they'd never really looked at me closely enough to notice when something changed, had never paid enough attention to know what was different or new or important in my life that existed beyond their peripheral awareness of my basic existence. Dinner was winding down into that languid phase where people pushed back from the table and settled into dessert and coffee, and my mother was in full storytelling mode. Her voice animated as she recounted details of Victoria's wedding for what felt like the 100th time that evening, saying, "Victoria's wedding was just so perfect. Everything was absolutely perfect. I've never seen anything so beautiful." And Victoria was glowing under the attention while Chad nodded along with proprietary pride, and I was thinking about the drive home and the relief of leaving when my mother turned to me with the casual interest she might show a distant acquaintance and said, "So Maya, when are you and—" She paused, searching. "Jason? Going to tie the knot?" And I felt James go still beside me, felt the familiar humiliation of her not knowing his name after 6 years wash over me one more time. And James said quietly, but clearly, "It's James. We've been together 6 years." His voice holding an edge I recognized as protective anger barely controlled. My mother waved her hand in that dismissive gesture I'd seen 1,000 times, the one that said details about my life were too inconsequential to retain, and she said, right, James. Sorry. Anyway, so when's the wedding? I mean, Victoria's was 18 months ago, and you two have been together forever. You must be planning something by now." And I could feel the attention of the table shifting toward us. Could sense my cousins and aunts and uncles tuning into a conversation that suddenly held the promise of something interesting. Could see Aunt Carol watching me with an expression that was equal parts concern and anticipation, because she knew exactly what was about to happen. The table was quieting, forks stilling on plates, conversations trailing off as people sensed some shift in energy, some undercurrent of tension that made them curious, and I put down my fork very carefully and looked directly at my mother for the first time all evening with real intention, not the glancing peripheral awareness I usually maintained, but actual direct eye contact, and I said in a voice that was calm and clear and absolutely steady, "I got married last year, October 14th. You weren't invited." The silence that descended was absolute and shocked, the kind of silence that felt physical in its weight, where you could hear the small sounds of the house settling and someone's breath catching and the distant hum of the refrigerator, and I watched my mother's face cycle through confusion to disbelief to something that looked like anger beginning to kindle behind her eyes, watched my father's fork freeze halfway to his mouth, watched Victoria's expression shift from boredom to sharp attention, watched the extended family members exchange glances that said they weren't sure they'd heard correctly, but were desperately curious to find out. My mother's voice cut through the silence, sharp and disbelieving. "What are you talking about? This is a joke. This is some kind of attention-seeking joke." And I looked at her with a calmness I'd earned through a year of distance and said, "No joke, Mom. It was a beautiful ceremony in Napa Valley, 40 guests, October 14th of last year, vineyard wedding at sunset." And I watched her face as she tried to process what I was saying, tried to make it make sense in a world where I was the daughter whose life didn't merit close attention. My father set down his fork with a clatter that seemed loud in the stretched tension and said, "You got married and didn't tell us?" His voice climbing toward outrage, and I met his eyes and said clearly, I got married and didn't invite you, Dad. There's a difference between not telling you after the fact and making an intentional choice not to include you. And I watched him absorb the distinction, watched him realize I was saying I'd deliberately excluded them, that this wasn't an oversight or elopement, but a conscious decision. Victoria's voice rose in that particular pitch she used when she wanted to be the center of sympathy and attention. Oh my God, this is so typical of you, making everything about you, making some dramatic scene at a family gathering. You can't stand that people were paying attention to someone else for once. And something in me that might once have folded under that accusation remained perfectly steady as I turned to her and said, Victoria, I haven't made anything about me in this family for 28 years. I made one day about me, one single day that you knew nothing about, because you've never been interested enough in my life to ask. I continued before anyone could interrupt, my voice level and factual. Mom and Dad, you gave Victoria $50,000 for her wedding and gave me $500. You told me my wedding would be a little courthouse thing when I mentioned it at Victoria's reception. You forgot my wedding date 3 times in one conversation. Mom gave a speech at Victoria's wedding about her daughters, but especially Victoria. I wasn't asked to be a bridesmaid while cousins I barely know were included. And when Aunt Carol asked me about my wedding at Victoria's reception, you said I wasn't in a rush, even though I'd just told you it was 6 weeks away. The specificity of my words seemed to land with physical weight, each example a small stone building into an undeniable pile of evidence, and I watched my parents' faces as they tried to formulate defenses that wouldn't quite come together into anything coherent. Aunt Carol's voice came quiet but firm from across the table. She's right. I was there at Maya's wedding. It was beautiful. It was one of the most joyful celebrations I've ever attended, and Maya looked happier than I'd ever seen her. And the shock that rippled through the extended family at this revelation was palpable. The understanding that Aunt Carol had known, had been included, had been trusted with this secret while they'd all been kept in the dark. My cousin Jennifer said, Wait, Aunt Carol, you knew? And Aunt Carol nodded and said, Yes, I was honored to be invited, and I understood completely why Maya made the choices she made about her guest list. And I felt gratitude wash through me for her steady support, for her willingness to speak truth in front of everyone, for her validation that made it clear this wasn't a fabrication or exaggeration, but documented reality that someone else had witnessed. My mother's face flushed a deep red that I recognized from childhood moments when her authority had been questioned, and she said with rising outrage, How could you exclude your own family from your wedding, Maya? How could you do something so cruel and vindictive? And I felt something settle in me like a foundation finding bedrock as I looked at her and said, How could you exclude me for 28 years, Mom? How could you make me feel like I didn't matter in my own family every single day of my life? And I began to list the accumulated evidence calmly and precisely, saying, You missed my college graduation because Victoria had a photography workshop in Santa Fe that weekend. You've never once asked about my work. Even though I'm a senior software engineer making $180,000 a year, you called my engagement ring practical while you cried over Victoria's for 20 minutes. You scheduled Victoria's bridal shower on my birthday and got annoyed when I mentioned the conflict. And each example landed in the silence like something solid and irrefutable. James spoke up beside me, his voice steady and clear. I've watched Maya try to get your attention for 6 years. I've watched her accomplish incredible things, and have you changed the subject back to Victoria within 30 seconds. I've been introduced to you at least 15 times, and you still called me Jason tonight. I've seen her face every time you've dismissed something important to her. And his witness testimony from someone outside the family dynamic seemed to carry a weight that made several of my aunts and uncles shift uncomfortably in their seats. My cousin Jennifer said quietly, I've noticed it too, Aunt Susan. I've always thought Maya kind of got the short end of things. And my Uncle Tom nodded slowly and said, Remember when Maya got accepted to Stanford and the dinner conversation was about Victoria's cheerleading tryouts? And I watched my parents' faces as they realized the pattern had been visible to others, that this wasn't just my distorted perception, but observable reality. My grandmother, who had been silent through most of the confrontation, set down her coffee cup with a decisive clink and said, "I've noticed this too. I've mentioned it to you, Susan, more than once over the years, and you always had excuses, but Maya's right." And the authority in her voice made my mother's mouth close on whatever defense she'd been formulating. My father tried a different approach, his voice taking on a reasoning tone as he said, "Victoria needed more support, Maya. She's always been more sensitive, more vulnerable. We had to give her extra attention." And I shook my head and said clearly, "No, Dad, she's not more sensitive. She's just your favorite. And you know what? That's fine. Parents have favorites, even though they're not supposed to. But I don't need to accept crumbs anymore. I don't need to keep showing up, hoping this will be the time you actually see me." Victoria's eyes filled with tears in that way she'd perfected as a child. The way that always brought parents and teachers and boyfriends rushing to her comfort. And she said, "I can't believe you're attacking me like this. I can't believe you're trying to ruin Thanksgiving because you're jealous." But I looked at her with something that felt like pity, mixed with exhaustion, and said, "Victoria, I'm not attacking you. I'm stating facts about how I've been treated, and the fact that you think my wedding is an attack on you kind of proves my entire point." And I watched her face struggle between trying for more tears and flashing into anger. My mother tried once more, saying, "We would have come to your wedding if you'd invited us. We would have been there for you." And I said, "Mom, you couldn't even remember my wedding date when I told you about it 3 times. You called it a courthouse thing when I'd told you we were planning a real ceremony. You gave me $500 and gave Victoria 50,000 and told me to be practical." And the numbers spoken aloud seemed to make the disparity undeniable even to her. I stood up from the table and felt James rise beside me in the same motion, our 6 years together making us synchronized in moments like this. And I said, "We're going to leave now," with a finality that didn't invite argument. And as I picked up my purse, I saw my cousin Jennifer looking at me with something like awe, and she said, "Maya, wait, can I see pictures? Can I see what your wedding looked like?" And I pulled out my phone and opened the album I'd kept private for a year and watched her face transform as she scrolled through images of the vineyard ceremony, the golden October light, me in my dress laughing with genuine joy. Jennifer said, "Maya, you look so happy. I've never seen you look like this, so completely yourself." And suddenly, there were other cousins crowding around, Aunt Linda and Uncle Tom leaning in to see, and I found myself showing them piece by piece the day my parents had never asked about, telling them about the ceremony under the oak tree, the reception in the stone cellar, the way James's parents had walked me down the aisle together because I'd asked them to, and they'd cried and said they'd be honored. My cousin Derek said, "What do you do again, Maya? I know you're in tech, but I realized I don't actually know the details." And I told him about my promotion 6 months ago to team lead, about managing a team of 12 engineers, about my salary that had just hit $200,000 with the latest raise, about the house James and I had bought in North Seattle with the view of the mountains. And I watched my extended family's faces register genuine interest and surprise, and something like shame that they'd never known these things about me. Uncle Tom said, 200,000, Jesus, Maya, that's incredible. I had no idea you were doing so well." And I wanted to say that he'd never asked, but I just smiled and said, "Thank you. It's been a lot of hard work, but I love what I do." And I saw him glance over at my parents who sat frozen in their seats watching this scene unfold. My mother's voice cut through the conversations with that edge of desperation that meant she was losing control of the narrative. "If you really loved us, Maya, you wouldn't hurt us like this. You wouldn't humiliate us in front of the whole family." And I turned to look at her fully and said with a clarity that came from a year of distance and healing, "If you loved me, Mom, you would have shown up for me. For once in my life, you would have actually shown up." And the simplicity of that truth seemed to echo in the dining room. Aunt Carol stood and came around the table and pulled me into a hug and whispered in my ear, "I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of the woman you've become. And I felt tears prick my eyes for the first time that evening. Not tears of hurt, but of gratitude for her steady presence in my life. My cousin Jennifer took my hand and said, "Can I have your number? Your real number? I want to actually know you, not just see you at these dinners." And Derek nodded and said, "Me too. I feel like we've missed out on knowing our cousin." And I gave them my contact information while my parents watched in silence. James's hand found the small of my back, supportive and grounding, and I looked around the table one more time, met my father's eyes, and saw something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or might have been just discomfort. Looked at Victoria, who had her arms crossed and her face set in that familiar expression of aggrieved martyrdom. Looked at my mother, who seemed smaller somehow than she had an hour ago. I said, "Happy Thanksgiving, everyone," to the room at large, and James and I walked out of my parents' house together with a dignity I'd never managed to find there before. And as we drove away, I looked back once at the lit windows and felt not longing, but a peaceful sort of closure. The knowledge that I'd spoken my truth, and whatever came next would come from a foundation of honesty rather than hope for crumbs of approval. The drive home felt longer than the 45 minutes it actually took, and I sat in the passenger seat watching the lights of the city appear as we descended from the hills where my parents lived, and I felt James's hand reach over to hold mine, and I realized I was shaking slightly from the adrenaline of finally speaking truths I'd held back for 28 years. I cried a little on the way home, not from sadness exactly, but from something more complicated, a mixture of relief and grief and liberation all tangled together, the feeling of having cut something away that had been part of me for so long that I wasn't quite sure yet what shape I'd be without it. A week after Thanksgiving, my mother left a voicemail that I listened to twice before I could fully process what she was saying, her voice moving through hurt and anger and settling finally on guilt as she said, "I can't believe you would embarrass us like that in front of the whole family, Maya. I can't sleep thinking about what everyone must think of us now. How could you be so selfish?" And I noticed that even in her pain, she made it about her embarrassment rather than my hurt. I didn't call back immediately. Instead, I talked with James over several evenings about what kind of relationship I actually wanted with my parents going forward, whether I wanted one at all, and he listened without pushing me toward either forgiveness or estrangement, but just helped me think through what would actually serve my well-being. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, a letter arrived from my father, 3 pages in his careful handwriting, and I read it standing at our kitchen counter and felt my hope rise and then fall as I realized it was a surface apology, words like "sorry you felt hurt" and "didn't mean to make you feel excluded," followed quickly by suggestions that we all just move past this for the sake of family harmony, really asking me to make peace for their comfort rather than acknowledging the depth of what had happened. I spent a weekend writing my response, drafting and redrafting until I had something that felt both honest and boundaried, and I outlined clearly what would need to change for us to have a real relationship. Genuine interest in my life, equal treatment with Victoria, acknowledgement of the pattern of favoritism, consistent effort over time. Not just promises, but actions. 3 months later in February, my mother called and asked if I would meet her for coffee, just the two of us. And I said yes after checking with James, who reminded me that I could leave at any time if I needed to, and I met her at a Starbucks halfway between our homes and watched her fidget with her cup as she offered half apologies that started strong, but always trailed off into justifications. I held my boundaries firmly through that conversation, saying, "I appreciate your trying, Mom, but I need you to understand that saying Victoria needed more attention doesn't excuse making me feel invisible." And I watched her struggle between her instinct to defend herself and her apparent desire to rebuild some kind of bridge. The relationship that emerged over the following months remained distant, but at least it was honest, built on what was actually true rather than my performance of gratitude for scraps, and I found I could talk to my mother for 20 minutes every few weeks without the old desperate hope that this would be the time she really saw me. Victoria sent me an angry text 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, calling me vindictive and attention seeking, and I read it once, felt the familiar pull to defend myself and explain and justify. And then I blocked her number and felt nothing but relief. Aunt Carol and I began having dinner once a month, and she told me stories about my childhood that I'd forgotten. Moments when she'd wanted to say something about the way my parents treated me, but hadn't known if it was her place. And I told her I wished she had, but I understood why she hadn't, and I was grateful she'd always made me feel valued, even when she couldn't change the bigger dynamic. The final scene of this chapter of my life happened on a regular Tuesday evening 6 months after that Thanksgiving, when James and I sat at his parents' dining table with his sister and brother-in-law and their kids, and his mother served pot roast and asked me detailed questions about the project I was leading at work, and actually listened to my answers and remembered them the next time I saw her. And I looked around at these people who had chosen to love me, not because they had to, but because they genuinely valued who I was. And I felt a contentment that was quiet and hard-won and completely genuine. I thought about the wedding photo that sat on our mantel at home. Me in my dress, laughing with my whole face. James looking at me like I was his whole world, golden October light making everything glow. And I realized that the peace I'd found hadn't come from my parents finally seeing my value, but from me seeing it myself clearly enough that I didn't need their vision anymore. And that was worth more than any apology they might eventually offer. That was the real vindication, knowing in my bones that I was enough exactly as I was, and I always had been.